Hey kids, if there's one thing I know about metal, it's that there's absolutely nothing controversial or divisive about it. Give us a pair of jeans and a riff that's mean, and we'll headbang merrily with no strife whatsoever. Okay, maybe there's some discord, but that's key for learning. We just need to talk to each other and work out our differences in the marketplace of ideas. Oh wow, that's quite a hot take, but there's nothing we can do to stop your free speech. Censorship is a great evil. Okay, that's pretty evil too. But whatever, I enjoy the music, and that's all that matters. I'm exceptionally gifted in the art of ideological separation. Just look at my signed copy of Mein Kampf. I can appreciate the fine literature without any negative repercussions at all. God, it's good to be apolitical. I can do whatever I want and not feel bad about it. Black metal. Dark, grim, evil, and believe it or not, polarizing. While bands such as Mayhem, Immortal, Dark Throne, and others have gained significant fame, black metal's roots in the underground and the legacy of the ancient forefathers hold immense weight and importance. Speaking of Dark Throne, let's hear how Fenris would describe the influences that shaped black metal as we know it.
Biggest inspiration on the Norwegian scene, and probably globally, Alt 88 from the late 80s, they include the whole Viking, pagan vibe, also a big hit, as we see in the 90s. So as we see from the facts here, it's clear that Battery, in my eyes, is really the most important. The third Battery album, which carries the most similarities to the 90s scene of all albums of the 80s. Black Mark album. This is where the audience should go, duh! Number one essential album. It had South America, early Sepultura. Yeah, let's include them. Then one of the absolutely finest bands to like, even nowadays, for the old school, or if you're a new school kid like this. Sarcophago, first album, Inri. Get it if you can, get it while you can. Rotting Christ. From Greece. But I'm mentioning this as a main band from Greece, but the Greek actually had mostly occult acts and very poorly always produced, not with any force behind it, and there was quickly established a sound that would later be called Greek sound, had a sound of their own. It wasn't like Italia had a sound of their own, Greek sound existed. We had Greek sound, Swedish sound, Norwegian sound, not Danish sound. We really had no press at all. It was just this Norwegian clique, and we were all listening to all that, more or less, give or take a few bands for, and that's why we had a similar sound. That German was actually starting a label was probably cool for like 80 people around the world, like really globally, because it's always been global. Jeromus made a big point by having a huge map in his office, having pins in the map from where he had contacts. Always want to have contacts in Africa and shit like that. He craved that. The quality of the music, for instance, was not important for him as long as it were from a troubled situation that it was supposed to be like a struggle to be a metaler. It should be hated. Important. I'm feeling like I'm going to feel when I complete the Dark album. One huge chore that I feel sliding off my shoulders now.
The inspiration these young Norwegians took from older bands around the world helped create true second-wave Norwegian black metal. Its specific sound and style are undoubtedly influenced by their cultural and geographic background, but only in addition to the inspiration received from abroad. That's right, not even Norwegian black metal is purely Norwegian. Even everybody's favorite malicious murderer, Varg, begrudgingly knows this, resulting in him denouncing all metal and derivatives of rock and roll as quote-unquote Judeo-Negroid, committing his artistic vision for Burzum towards a more pure musical form, which is totally not a derivative of rock and roll, he swears. I bring this up because a main point of contention in black metal is the dynamic purity, nationalism, and supremacy play in shaping the sound and image of the music. While a vocal and greasy minority adhere vehemently to the aforementioned characteristics, the vast majority of black metal fans and artists are at the very least less dedicated to the Aryan cause. This by no means absolves the subgenre of its fascist connections, but it would be silly to reduce black metal's roots to fascism. What we'll discuss here is how metalheads react and respond to the controversial presence of black metal, and how a myriad of factors such as culture, geography, and of course class impact the relationship fascism has with black metal. National Socialist Black Metal, Lots of people outright disavow this subgenre, primarily by the obnoxiously egalitarian subgenre, red anarchist black metal. By the way, I'm just gonna say NSBM, RABM, go fuck yourself. And generally by metalheads, not exactly tickled by fascist ideology. Of course, the main defenders of NSBM are, you guessed it, the literal fascists who enjoy a blast beat just as much as a blast furnace. However, smack dab in the center of the Overton window, there remains a large portion of metalheads who may not be outright Nazis, but nevertheless claim to enjoy the Hitlerian music, separate from the stash, if you will. Separating the art from the artist isn't a new or NSBM exclusive activity. There are some unsavory, unlikable, or otherwise batshit insane artists whose level of artistry transcends the mortal flesh into an incorporeal experience undeniable to enjoyers of music. There are countless examples of artists fitting this description, including a number of metal musicians, breaking the constraints of their incorrigible insufferability by delivering some legendary music. A prime example being John Notfight from melodic black metal band Dissection. Storm of the Light's Bane and The Somber Lane are undeniable classics and some of my personal favorites, revolutionizing black metal and further blurring the lines between subgenres. Doing so under the age of 20, causing generations of metal musicians to introspect harder than your dad, who could have made a coach. Young John lived happily ever after, basking in the success of his masterpieces. Just kidding, he was a part of his local neighborhood misanthropic Luciferian order, jailed for accessory to the murder of a gay man, and committed suicide at the age of 31. Notfight's esoteric Satanism and obsession with chaos could be argued as being Nazi adjacent, and we'll get to this later, but that has more so to do with the quirky guru-esque class obscuring esoterica than with professed fascism. Digging through symbolism and assessing sketchiness is a favorite pastime of those seeking to enjoy black metal guilt-free. I got news for you. If you listen to black metal, you should feel guilty. Despite the noble intentions, it's pretty fucking obvious what's sketch or not, unless you've been living under a rock since 1932. We'll get into symbology later, but remember that fascist creativity is limited to things already perceived as attractive to a large amount of people. They like to prey on the universal love of Lord of the Rings and other dark fantasy imagery to seduce nerds and losers like us into far-right ideology, similar to many other demographics and subcultures, but in metal, we really fucking love dragons and swords and shit. NSBM isn't able to be classified as such without either explicit fascist lyrical themes or fascistic intent directing the production of black metal music. Kim Kelly aptly referred to NSBM as well as RABM as, quote, one of those loose, non-genre genres with which metal is so rife. It's a political and aesthetic orientation as opposed to a distinct sound. Being a fascist does not directly impact the sound of the black metal by virtue of distinctive, racist tremolo picking skills or noticeably nationalist blast beats. The themes from RABM, or any black metal for that matter. Rawness, vulgarity, brutality, darkness, even esoteric paganism and misanthropy, as well as any other aspect of black metal deemed evil or polarizing, is not exclusive to NSBM, but the thematic and lyrical inclusion of racial or cultural supremacy, anti-communism, and the fetishization of Germanic history are primarily utilized in NSBM. A fan of NSBM I spoke to let it out like this. A ton of NSBM sounds similar to ordinary black metal style, but some of it does sound different, having a more triumphant sound. Obviously, the National Socialist themes are what set it apart from the ordinary black metal. I would say they are obviously a lot related to this first or second wave black metal band, and a lot of them play in a similar style. Most of the time, the only difference is the lyrical content. While I can understand what he meant by triumphant, I think that can describe any number of black metal artists, the only difference being who is triumphed over, and hence, highlighting the significance of intent. Intent is the most important factor when determining what is or isn't NSBM. John Nodfight killing a gay person, being an esoteric maniac, and having Nazi fans does not make Dissection NSBM. The themes and intent of Dissection primarily revolve around Nodfight's obsession with his edgelord satanic chaos headcanon. He is indeed an edgelord, an asshole, a deranged lunatic probably, but that alone does not make him a fascist or his music fascistic. Nordic, pagan, or Viking themes don't outright make music fascistic, but referring to the Nordic race as superior and urging genocide is fascistic. War, battles, slaughter, and extreme violence aren't exclusively fascistic, but glorifying these concepts in relation to an outgroup being slaughtered, or for an unholy war to be waged towards, is something the Nazis could get behind, you get it. But to make things a bit messier, there are a number of NSBM bands who also revolve their music and lyrics around edgy, esoteric headcanons. These bands usually don't directly exclaim love for the Fuhrer in their music, but a skin-deep analysis of their lyrics, in tandem with the artist's vision and intent, leave us with a pretty clear idea of their fascistic ideology, one that harkens back to a more pure era, devoid of the undesirable influence present today, and highlighting a frustration with the world seemingly moving past pasty, greasy, true cultures. It may seem odd why these people, clearly devoted to their fascistic convictions, shy away from outright Nazi support. Obviously, there are plenty of NSBM acts such as Gestapo 666, Eugenic, and Aryan Blood, who couldn't possibly be more on the nose. But most prevalent NSBM bands take the symbolic route, paganism, lycanthropy, Nordic culture, war, etc. Why don't these bands unabashedly throw up the Super C? And despite not having swastikas tattooed on their foreheads, why are they still clearly fascistic? It's worthwhile to discuss what fascism actually is, as opposed to being just that one silly trigger word. For a concept as misunderstood as fascism, a good place to start is fascism is capitalism in decay. No, that doesn't mean your neighborhood rundown Radio Shack is a Nazi hotbed. It means that when the capitalist system is threatened, challenged, or otherwise put at risk, the ruling powers will utilize any means necessary to preserve the current power structure, including total state-corporation collusion, vilification, relocation, and extermination of outgroups, and a pervasive propaganda campaign to unite the status quo, who may at this point feel alienated by a changing world, against said demonized outgroups. It's important to remember that the ruling powers, facing potential revolution and clinging to authority, will take advantage of societal strife by channeling the outrage of the current status quo into a bludgeon to be used against the forces of revolution. These forces may perceive themselves to be part of their own revolution or under attack, but in reality, it is they who defend the dominant class's interests against an alternative system. The enemies and outgroups they oppose are not concrete or fixed. They may allow some of the good ones, or have some hipster idea on who to scapegoat, but the fascist will always have any group other than their own to blame for society's ills, eventually whittling down society into an ever-shrinking pool of only the purest. Quick side note about being one of the good ones. Just like how there can be a good Jew or a good homosexual, there can be good metalheads as long as you toe the fascist line. And this does not protect any of these groups from future persecution. As soon as you're perceived as a threat towards ideological hegemony, or not pure enough, welcome to outgroupdom. How long do you think a pure fascist regime would tolerate these guys? No one is just one single thing, intersectionality and shit, which means eventually any identifier can and will be deemed an outgroup, when convenient. This is a good place to bring up the misconception of fascism as solely a fundamentalist Christian cult. While a large portion of Nazis were Christian, and Christianity served as a capable vessel for fascism to this day, remember all the talk about symbology and whatnot? Allow me to introduce you to mystic fascism. If you're interested in a deep dive, read this article. Mystic fascism isn't just Hitler specking more into intelligence for his warlock bill. Going back at least to the middle 19th century, when societal and technological changes were rapidly impacting feudalistic and nationalist sentiments, the Age of Enlightenment and its infectious rationality caused the European middle and upper class to seek excuses for their arbitrary dominance in society. What do you mean all men are created equal? And thus, Theosophy was born. It's described in the article as a movement of ideas, though often called a religion, consisting of occult and esoteric concepts that bring together several elements of Gnosticism, Tibetan and Indian Buddhism, and Hinduism and generally Orientalist ideas. It was formed as a reaction to the rationalist movements born out of the Enlightenment in the 19th century, a rejection of modern utilitarianism, and more specifically, a firm belief in the significance of humanity in relation to the cosmos. To be clear, however, it was not a belief in the import of man in his living being, but a rejection of humanity and human history as born of real and insignificant circumstances, in favor of perceiving humanity as a substance disconnected from such living being. This denial of reality in favor of a mythologized supremacy obscured history and the very concept of humanity, so much as to make contradiction impossible. Christianity provided the esoteric pearl necessary for this level of obscurantism and mysticism, but too much structure and perceived love of humanity to truly reach the mythological level capable of excusing potential genocide. Not really, but it was basically too mainstream. The theosophical consensus was, quote, very hostile towards Christianity as an organized religion, though not towards the true esoteric core she claimed it, like all other major religions, possessed. This is no coincidence, as other major religions such as Buddhism and Hinduism were similarly fantasized over their inclusion of eternal cycles, priest-king lineages, and caste society structures. Rich Europeans spent decades amassing evidence, forming clubs and organizations, and endlessly contorting religion and pseudoscience into proof of their supremacy and cosmic right to earthly dominance. If you want all the details, again, read that article. But, stated concisely, the esoteric, cyclical, and class hierarchical components of Oriental religions were appropriated by the ruling class of Western society due to their potential for religious justification of class subjugation. Rich Europeans really liked how there is a subhuman sect of people to do slave labor, come all conveniently. Wow! This, in tandem with a time of turmoil such as around World War I, provided a perfect opportunity to blame these problems not on a self-destructive capitalistic system, but on the subhumans, namely Jews, who historically served the Teutonic priest-king like dogs, but now to modernism and communism have infected our society and need to get back to dog-like status, just as the cycle foretold. Any of this ring a bell yet? Heading over to pre-World War II Germany, it was quite the chaotic time. Political tensions were escalated as high as could be, with the recent Bolshevik Revolution terrifying rulers and corporations, and post-war quality of life making communism seem like an ever more enticing idea. Due to this potential threat to the status quo, those most privileged by the system were the most outraged and alienated by a suggested alternative. Obviously, the right-wingers at this time weren't exactly enthused by the economic situation, but the rise of fascism is rooted in the blaming of an ever-increasing list of outgroups for these problems, as opposed to the boom and bust cycle of a capitalist economy. Who were some of those people? Yep, Mr. H himself, as well as all the massive German corporation, who took a liking to the brown-shirted bigot and, long story short, utilized the Nazi Party's outrage to suppress a potential communist revolution, at the cost of ushering in a fascist dictatorship. We can't fail to mention that Hitler and European corporate owners were part of similar esoteric clubs, coincidentally agreeing on their pseudo-historic supremacy, and need to get back to the good old days of the cycle. There is a ton more detail we can go into the history of Nazi Germany, as well as the fascist Italy and Spain, but the main point to grasp here is that when confronted with a revolutionary alternative, the entrenched status quo will let loose its twin brother fascism to crack down on the egalitarian rabble. Because fascism is brought out in politically extreme and radical settings, it is no mistake that metal, known for its extremity and radicalism, provides the basis for extreme far-right sentiment, just as it may for far-left sentiment. This boundless expanse of potential expression is bound to attract those who wish to express their fascistic ideology, usually including really edgy, dark fantasy-loving demographics that are particularly vulnerable to warmongering, dark, fascist rhetoric, similar to the theosophical movements of yesteryear and the whole manosphere kind of thing today. The extreme nature of metal and its intersection with dark fantasy leave just enough space for fascist rhetoricians to weasel their way in, taking advantage of those enamored with epic battles and demonic hordes by glorifying war, supremacy, and hostility. Enjoyed reading about the War of the Dwarves and Orcs? You can participate in your very own war here in Nova Scotia. Of course, we're the badass orcs. And don't worry, there's no shortage of enemies to righteously slaughter. Metal can and has been commodified into a status quo line-toting product, with capitalism penetrating deep into the fringes of entertainment and culture. But the inherent qualities of boundary breaking and line pushing make authentic extreme metal diametrically opposed to homogeneous capitalist society. So, if fascist metal is too extreme for the status quo, how is it supportive of the capitalist structure? First of all, the battles taking place in extreme metal are on the fringes of accepted political ideology. The dominant powers, when entrenched as comfortably as they are now, do not need to enforce its power structure under the jackboot of fascism. Liberalism's strength is its normalcy and blunting of potentially revolutionary or subversive ideology. Why beat the outspoken kid up if you can just throw him in front of a TV? The milkenness of the status quo uses its normalcy to equate any radicalism with each other. Nazi and commie are simply the crazy ones. But this does not mean when push comes to shove, capital won't pick up that fasces to beat down a pesky communist revolt. In the meantime, fascist ideology, conscious of its extreme image in a conformist, milken society, utilizes symbolism and veiled rhetoric to prepare for a moment where things seem on the brink of revolution. Occult proto-fascist clubs predicted World War I as the great catalyst for the next phase of the eternal cycle, which is seen as an adequate excuse for the genocide of Jews and other outgroups. Disregard any material analysis of the causes of World War I or its aftermath. Here's a nice, quick, easy explanation. In other words, NSBM is like the Black Watch all the way up in the north, defending Westeros from the distant threat of the Red Walkers. But in King's Landing, the Black Watch is regarded as freaks and weirdos despite their steadfast preservation of the realm, and despite being run and supported by the very same aristocracy. I bet you didn't expect a Game of Thrones analogy, but I think it fits fairly well. Additionally, war is something our society fetishizes in many different ways, kind of transcending its inherent extremity. We can tell ourselves that war bad, but then take a look at our glorious veterans, the countless holidays and monuments, media representations, and, yes, some dope shit like this. The difference being this is fake, but when we're told about the valiant heroism of killers and the impending destruction at the hands of our dastardly enemies, it's no surprise that we associate real-world dynamics into these fantasy settings. It's okay to want to slay your enemies because Geralt did it. So, roundabout way of arriving to this point, the alienation and depravity of NSBM is based in its relation to the status quo as outcast defenders, united against the impending communist horde threatening to subvert a system that has for so long benefited their ilk by way of conjuring a glorious past where their supremacy was uncontested. The threat of revolution is what causes the racist, misogynistic, and hierarchical reaction by those most supported by a system rooted in racial, patriarchal, and class supremacy. Now that we know how fascism uses metal to fit their ideology, let's ask why NSBM is so popular. The large majority of metalheads who are fans of NSBM are outright fascists, or at least extremely far right. The simple fact that these bands make music with white supremacist, anti-communist, and otherwise fascistic lyrics and intent, combined with the previously stated fact that the only qualifiers for black metal to be labeled as NSBM are lyrics and intent, means that you knowingly consume, enjoy, and financially support music that's only distinguishment is fascistic intent. You can be consciously aware of the fascist rhetoric and enjoy NSBM. I like early Judas Iscariot and Graveland. But there's a clear and obvious difference between liking the music and knowing it's made by greasy racist goblins, and liking the music and thinking, what do they mean? And again, the only distinction between NSBM and any number of non-National Socialist, raw, brutal, or dark black metal artists is the fascist intent. If that's the reason you like these bands, or you say, the sketchier the better, then you are a fascist. Don't try to symbolically hide or contort your brain needlessly. Just come out and say it. Speaking of denial, the main obscurant in figuring out whether a band is NSBM or not is the recurrence of other symbolic themes such as or nihilism. While not exclusive to NSBM, The usage of these themes therein are in obvious relation to their depressing woe is me attitude towards the world moving away from the good old white man, as opposed to Nazis being on the forefront of mental health awareness. This is in fitting accordance to the theosophy of the Nazis, in which humanity is just another animal, destined for death, except the great priest king, destined to rule over everyone, of which coincidentally we are. As a reminder, a key part of fascist ideology is a fixation on a better time, a glorious age, where their supremacy was unabated and free from undesirable influence. Sure, some of this sentiment is towards religion and how much they hate it, but is that surprising considering what we previously discussed about theosophy, and more recently the amazing atheist pipeline? The hatred of religion and humanity in general, in NSBM, is rooted in supremacy, regardless of whether the fascists will resort to suicide or embolden the resistance to prove their supremacy. This is why intent is so important to understand. If we blindly equate all hatred of religion and metal to each other, it'll obviously take away from how those conclusions were reached. Also, their ideological bleakness and depression is in no small part caused by late-stage capitalism. But why bore yourself to death with that tanky drivel when you can fantasize about killing brown people instead? Just as the proto-fascists of 19th and 20th century Europe blame any number of outgroups for capitalist exploitation, we see fascist and black metal resort to similar excuses as to why they can't get laid, for capitalist problems. One other thing, even though they support something as reprehensible and at least questionable as fascism, and relentlessly harass children who just bought Baby's first black metal album, they never ceased to cry about getting digital and physical beatdowns themselves. Make fun of the 14-year-old who just sewed on her mayhem patch right next to the queer pride flag all you want. You look just as, if not more pathetic, with your Totenkopfs and Totenbergs, practically begging for at least the history lesson, and probably more deservingly, another beatdown. Let's be real. No matter how annoying virtue signalers and those obsessed with sketchiness are, there will always be the fact that at the very least, they are opposed to fascism. I'll gladly pain my way through legions of ham-fisted battle jacket equivalents of girl bossing, than risk being killed for having my nose size be too large for the smug conqueror fanboy. How is this any less cringe? If forcing your ideals and politics onto others is so unbearably cringe, what the fuck does this make you? Shouldn't you be in a cave somewhere, cranking your gramophone, being as true and sad as possible? Although they may wish it to be true, these people are not orcs, and most of the time, are not too dissimilar from you or I. Again, the whole manosphere thing applies well to NSBM fans, taking mostly young, white men, definitely not with family problems or anything, who enjoy metal things such as dark fantasy, gaming, ancient history, cool shit like that, and utilizing the edge and alienation present in these demographics to foster reactionary, far-right ideology. The themes of extreme violence, glorious warfare, darkness and evil, etc., are fertile breeding ground for edgelords, seeking ever more edgy shit, something fascist rhetoricians take advantage of. Varg is black metal Andrew Tate, pretty much. Young guys, experiencing alienation or emotional trauma in one form or another, gravitate towards nerd culture shit, often being dark and fantastical, to fill some form of emotional void they may have. The kayfabe present in black metal allows these demographics to become the demon or the orc they thought was so cool after watching Lord of the Rings or playing Dark Souls. They then go down rabbit holes and pipelines and end up with influences such as Varg or whoever scratches their edge itch hard enough. Edginess thus becomes synonymous with art and expression, and who but the kings of edge themselves to take advantage of these newfound budding neo-Nazis. The obsession with edge and meta-irony is responsible for a lot of the popularization of NSBM, for simple reasons like racism, recycled nationalist propaganda. Things all too familiar for young white men in America and Europe. For those not turned into outright Nazis, misanthropy and doomerism aren't far behind when you realize you don't exactly fit into the master race. This is where I think a lot of the discord takes place, between those opposed to fascism and those too attached to edginess to outright denounce something as magnificently edgy as fascism. It's too cringe to call out Nazis, but it's based as fuck to crawl in a hole and literally die. As previously mentioned, the black pill prescription here is in the largest part due to the failings of late-stage capitalism, but an acknowledgement of this reality and potential radical revolutionary action is cause enough for the status quo to foster obscurant and reactionary sentiment amongst its populace. Nazis and misanthropes are far more beneficial to capital accumulation than some rambunctious communist revolutionaries. No matter how esoteric and malevolent your headcanon is, the obscurant effect you have on potentially revolutionary populations is much appreciated by the corporations of King's Landing. All of this is closely related to the particulars in Scandinavian society. As Americans, it's easy to fall for the socialist paradise aesthetic these countries masquerade as, but the prevalence of racism, homophobia, xenophobia, just any kind of bigotry, etc. All things we Americans can easily relate to, and all things any capitalist society can relate to, deeply impact the ideological currents in said societies. Big Black Peter has a quote that more or less exemplifies the innocent demeanor that accompanies ingrained cultural bigotry. Another classic example of, I'm not racist, but... In short, don't blame Riffs and Ratlord for the systemic issues fostered by the capitalist structure. History has shown the tendency of reactionaries to blame any number of things for the world's demise, as opposed to capitalism. I know it may not seem very based and cult for demonic lycanthrope to understand the problems of capitalism, but whatever outgroup you decide to blame could just as well have been you. Basically, listen to whatever you want, even NSBM. But you will be judged on your reaction to that music, whether it be conscious criticality or ideological congruence. Black metal is edgy. It's dark, evil, raw, gross even. All things that can describe fascism as well. However, it is solely our intent that links the two, not the music itself. You intend to uphold fascistic ideals when you praise NSBM artists at the expense of other metal. You intend to defend fascistic ideals when crying about backlash received. You intend to be a Nazi when you adorn yourself with NSBM merchandise and symbology, and take comfort in its rhetoric. This intent is violent, white supremacist, patriarchal, and directly opposed to artistic freedom. That's not on the 12-year-old liquid death corpse painter or the dastardly SJW, but on you. As long as metal remains extreme, it will attract those seeking to affirm their extreme ideologies, including Nazis. What can we do about it? Remain conscious in our consumption of extreme music. Bang your head to some NSBM, but don't bang the heads off the listed outgroups you arbitrarily deem lesser. And don't figuratively bang the artists intending to express his fascism, unless you're a fascist. We have to remember the violent and repressive history of fascism, and understand its long-term impact on artistic expression. We simply would not have black metal if fascist ideology is extrapolated. Like it or not, black metal is artistic expression, to most people quite cringe, and even pretty gay. Most black metal fans understand this, and it's sort of a recurring self-deprecating joke. And that's okay. We can have fun listening to crazy music and acting like demons. But that's only possible by defying societal norms imposed by a status quo that fosters racist, sexist, or otherwise supremacist beliefs. If you are really just a fan of black, hateful metal, ask yourself why you're so hateful, and towards what. Chances are it's got a little something to do with late-stage capitalism, which surprisingly is acknowledged sometimes by neo-Nazis, but is quickly negated by outgroup targeting and root cause obscurity, of course. You can think that you're a based Europe slaying your enemies, but you're just a pawn of Daddy Sauron at the end of the day.